queen for 1,000 days, accused of betraying her husband with 5 men, one of them her own brother. Every charge invented, the whole case assembled in 3 weeks by the one man who needed her gone. She died dressed as a queen, on a scaffold, beheaded by a swordsman shipped across the sea from France, because a French blade was cleaner than an English axe, and someone decided that counted as mercy. History remembers her as the witch who bewitched a king. It says she had 6 fingers and a mark of the devil hidden on her skin. Every word of that was invented, 50 years after she was dead, by a man who was a child when she died, and who never once saw her face. And in the telling, history forgot the one thing that mattered most: that she handed England its greatest monarch, and then was scratched, deliberately, off the walls and out of the record. So who was she, really? And why did they need her erased? We do not know the year Anne Boleyn was born, and that, it turns out, is the first thing her enemies took from her. No birth record survives. Her age has to be reconstructed rather than read off a page, and the 2 leading dates, around 1501 and around 1507, are still argued over by serious historians today. Eric Ives, whose biography remains the benchmark, reads a letter Anne wrote in 1514 as the work of an older girl and settles on roughly 1501. Others read the same letter as a child's and push it later. We will not pretend to know what the record does not. What we can say is simpler and more important. By the time a king noticed her, Anne was a grown woman, not a girl. And she came from a house on the make. The Boleyns were not ancient blood. They climbed, through trade, through law, through carefully chosen marriages. Anne's great-great-grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, was a London mercer, a cloth merchant who rose to Lord Mayor and had money enough to buy his family into the landed gentry, purchasing Blickling in Norfolk, where Anne was likely born, and Hever Castle in Kent, where she was raised. This matters because it explains the whole shape of her life. Everything the Boleyns had, they had earned or married into, which meant they could never rest and never stop climbing. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, is the man legend turns into a pimp who sold his daughters to the king for advancement. Set that aside, it is Tudor gossip, repeated for centuries, but it is not fact. The real Thomas was one of Henry's most gifted diplomats, fluent in French and Latin, trusted on delicate missions abroad, later raised to Earl of Wiltshire on the strength of his own service. Ambitious, certainly, a man of his time and his class, but able, and there is no evidence he trafficked his children. That version of him was invented later to make the whole family sordid. Anne's mother was Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, which grafted grand, ancient Howard blood onto restless Boleyn hunger and gave the family a foothold among the oldest names in the realm. And 2 of Anne's siblings will shape everything that follows. Her elder sister, Mary, would herself become a mistress of Henry VIII, used and then quietly set aside, a fate that will matter enormously when we watch what Anne chose to do differently. And her brother, George Boleyn, brilliant and reform-minded, would rise beside her at court, and in the end die beside her too. Hold on to this about the house that made Anne Boleyn. It was a machine built for climbing, wound tight by generations of ambition, and married into the most dangerous family in England. That machine lifted her to a throne, and when it was told to, it would turn and grind her down. Remember the name Howard, because the same family blood that lifted Anne into the reach of a crown would, within a single generation, sit in judgment on her and sign its name to the warrant for her death. While the daughters of grander houses were learning to embroider, a merchant's great-granddaughter was being educated in the most sophisticated courts in Europe. This is the part of Anne Boleyn's story that the legend of the seductress cannot survive, and precisely the part it leaves out. It began around 1513, when Anne was roughly 12. Her father used his diplomatic connections to win her a coveted place at the court of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, at Mechelen. This was no finishing school. Margaret's court was one of the great humanist centres of the age, a place Erasmus himself moved through, with a famous library and a culture that prized learning in women as well as men. Margaret took to the girl at once, praising her as bright and pleasant far beyond her years. For a child of a still-climbing English family, it was an extraordinary door to walk through, and Anne walked through it well. From there, she went to France, and stayed for something like 7 years. She crossed the Channel in the household of Henry's own sister, Mary Tudor, who had married the aging King Louis XII. When that marriage ended with the old king's death, Anne stayed on, and entered the service of Queen Claude of France, where she would remain for the better part of a decade. These were her formative years, spent not on the edge of a court, but inside the French royal household, at the very centre of European fashion, music, and manners. And it was here that the most consequential part of her education happened, the part with no dancing in it. In France, Anne moved within the orbit of Marguerite d'Angoulême, the king's brilliant sister, later Queen of Navarre, a formidable intellectual, a writer in her own right, and a protector of the men, then quietly arguing for the reform of the church. This is where Anne was first exposed to evangelical, reformist ideas, the notion that faith should rest on scripture read plainly, in a language ordinary people could understand, and that the church as it stood had drifted a long way from its source. Note the word carefully: reformist, evangelical, not Protestant. That label belongs to a later age, and would be an anachronism here. Anne did not invent these ideas, and she never stopped calling herself a faithful Christian, but she absorbed them young, at close range, from people who took them seriously and paid a price for them. Understand what all of this made her, because this is the whole point. Anne came home fluent in French, musically accomplished, quick-witted, and dressed in a style England had not yet seen. She could hold a room in 2 languages. She could outread, out-talk, and out-style almost anyone at the English court. Not because she was beautiful, but because she had been trained, in the finest courts on the continent, into something England had never met. That is why she stood out. And it is why, one day, she would be able to hand a king the intellectual weapons to break an entire nation away from Rome. Because the reformist ideas she first breathed in a French queen's household would, 20 years later, help pull England out of the arms of the Pope. At her first great appearance at the English court, Anne Boleyn was cast, by chance, as a virtue called perseverance. She would need every ounce of it. She had come home to England in early 1522, not, at first, for glory, but to settle a family dispute. There was a plan to marry her to an Irish cousin, James Butler, and end a long quarrel over an earldom. The match collapsed, as so many arrangements did. But the collapse left Anne exactly where her talents could be seen, at court, appointed a maid of honour to the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. Her debut came on the 4th of March 1522 at a lavish court entertainment called the Château Vert, the Green Castle, an allegorical pageant in which the ladies of the court each played a virtue to be won. Anne was given the role of perseverance. It is the kind of detail that looks, in hindsight, almost written, because perseverance is precisely what her whole life would demand, and precisely what it would cost her. Then came the first time powerful men reached into Anne's life and overruled her heart. She formed a genuine attachment to Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, a real bond, and by some accounts, a secret betrothal. It was broken up. According to the account of George Cavendish, it was Cardinal Wolsey who intervened to end it, and Percy's own father who refused to support the match. Whether Wolsey acted for himself or at the king's quiet direction, the meaning for Anne was the same. Her own wishes counted for nothing against the will of the men above her, and it planted something that would matter enormously later, a personal grudge against Wolsey, the most powerful man in England after the king. There was admiration around her too. The poet Sir Thomas Wyatt was drawn to her, and his verse, most famously, Whoso list to hunt, with its warning that this was a deer already claimed, marked as belonging to Caesar, forbidden to touch, is traditionally read as being about Anne. Read it as tribute, though, not as scandal. It is a poet's admiration for a woman he knew he could not have, and there is no proof whatever of an affair. Later enemies would seize on Wyatt's name and try to make it evidence of something, which is exactly why the distinction matters. What the poem really records is not a romance, but her effect on the people around her. Anne was not the era's picture of a conventional beauty. She was something rarer and harder to name, magnetic, sharp, with dark, striking eyes and a confidence that made her impossible to ignore. And in tearing her from Henry Percy, the cardinal who thought he was tidying up a courtship had just made an enemy who would one day help end him. The story you were told is that Anne Boleyn seduced a married king. The 17 surviving love letters tell the opposite story, because every one of them was written by him. Sometime in the mid-1520s, Henry VIII, King of England, decided he wanted Anne Boleyn, and here the legend and the evidence part company completely. The legend says she schemed her way into a king's bed and levered a wife out of a marriage. What actually happened is that she said no, not once, and not coyly, for years. To understand how extraordinary that refusal was, you have to remember what she had already watched happen inside her own family. Her elder sister, Mary, had been Henry's mistress. Mary had given the king what he asked for, and Mary had been used, set aside, and quietly returned to the margins of court, with nothing to show for it but a ruined name. Anne had seen exactly where that road ended, and she refused to walk down it. That refusal is the whole of her that people get backwards, because to refuse a king is not a small thing. This was a man who could make or unmake a family with a sentence. A woman in Anne's position had precisely one source of leverage in the entire world, the king's desire, and the ordinary way to spend that leverage was to surrender to it and hope for gifts. Anne did the opposite. She withheld. She let the wanting build. She held out not for a night or a season of favor, but for marriage, for a crown or nothing. It was the single most dangerous gamble a woman of that century could make, and she made it deliberately, with her eyes open. We know it was Henry doing the chasing because, against every instinct he had, he sat down and wrote to her. This is a king who, by his own admission, hated writing letters, who avoided the pen the way other men avoid confession. And yet 17 letters from Henry to Anne survive, written roughly between 1526 and 1528, in his own restless hand, in English and in French. They are not the letters of a man in control. They are anxious. They are pleading. They circle back on themselves. In them he complains that he does not know where he stands with her, begs for a word, calls himself her servant. 3 separate times he draws a small heart around her initials, like a boy carving into a desk. And of her side of it, her answers, her terms, her voice, almost nothing survives. She is the silence the letters keep reaching toward. That silence is the point. The courtship stretched across 6, nearly 7 years, and a passing conquest does not take 7 years. The length of the wait is itself the proof. She was not swept away by a king, she was managing one. The letters that prove how hard he chased her would one day be stolen out of her keeping and carried across Europe to Rome, where, in the hands of the men who wanted this marriage undone, the private evidence of a king's obsession would be turned into a weapon against the woman he had obsessed over. To marry Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII broke 1,000 years of England's bond with Rome. But Anne was not the prize the Reformation was fought over. She was one of the people fighting it. It began as a divorce and became a revolution. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. He called it his great matter, so that he could marry Anne and finally get a legitimate son. To do it, he needed the Pope's blessing, and the Pope would not give it. And here is where a private problem cracked open into a national one. Because when Rome said no, Henry did not back down. He began, slowly and then all at once, to ask a heretical question. What if a king of England did not need Rome's permission for anything at all? Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful minister in the land, was the man charged with delivering the annulment. He could not. And so Wolsey fell in 1529 and was dead within the year. The first great figure, the great matter swallowed whole. Now, the easy version of this history makes Anne a bystander. The pretty reason a king happened to change a church. That version is wrong, and correcting it is the whole point of this chapter. Anne did not merely benefit from the break with Rome, she helped drive it. She was, by the standards of her day, a genuinely dangerous woman to have near a king, because she had been reading things she was not supposed to read. She put a book directly into Henry's hands, William Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man. Its argument was electric and, to Rome, poisonous, that a king answers to God alone and to no pope on earth. Henry read it and reportedly said it was a book for him and for all kings to read. She had handed him not a love token but a theological weapon, the exact justification he needed to declare himself the head of his own church. This is why she mattered. She did not just want the crown, she was arming the man who could reshape a nation to give it to her. And it went further than one book. Men imprisoned for smuggling the banned English Bible into England petitioned her for protection, because it was known that the reformers had a friend beside the king. She sheltered them. She used her rising influence to advance the very men who would remake England's church from the inside. She helped raise Thomas Cranmer to Archbishop of Canterbury, and pushed forward reformers like Hugh Latimer. A word here is careful, and it matters. She was a reformer, an evangelical, not what a later century would call a Protestant. She died, still using the old forms of faith. But the current she rode and steered was the one that would carry England out of Rome's arms for good. The machinery moved fast now. In secret, around the 25th of January 1533, Henry and Anne were married, and Anne was already pregnant, the succession quite literally growing inside her. That spring, Cranmer, the archbishop her influence had helped create, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. And the following year, the Act of Supremacy made it law. Henry, not the Pope, was supreme head of the Church of England. A woman who read forbidden books had helped tear a kingdom loose from Christendom. But the same drive for reform that made her powerful was making her enemies, over the spoils of a dissolving church, over the future of England's faith. And chief among those watching, calculating, was the one man clever enough to build the case that would one day kill her. For one day in June 1533, a merchant's great-granddaughter wore the crown reserved for kings, and everyone was told the child inside her was a boy. On the 1st of June 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey, and she made her entrance roughly 6 months pregnant, her body itself, the promise the whole ceremony was built around. But look closely at what they placed on her head, because the choice was deliberate and it was loud. She was crowned with St. Edward's crown, the heavy, sacred crown normally reserved for a reigning monarch at his own coronation. Queen's consort were not crowned with it. Anne was. It was a signal sent to everyone in that abbey, and everyone who would hear of it. The child she carried was presumed to be a king, and the woman carrying him was no ordinary consort. This was a dynasty being declared, in gold, in advance. She chose her own symbols to match. Her motto was La plus heureuse, the most happy. Her badge was a crowned white falcon, a bird of prey standing on a tree stump that burst into Tudor roses, a predator wearing an imperial crown, rising out of the royal line itself. It was ambition, rendered as heraldry, and she wore it openly. But the queen the legend forgets is not the one in the crown, it is the one on her knees. Anne's faith was not decoration, It drove how she used her new power. On Maundy Thursday, she performed the old ritual of humility with real conviction, washing and kissing the feet of poor women and pressing a coin into each of their purses. Her chaplain, and, decades later, the martyrologist John Fox, recorded that her giving to the poor was vast. Fox's figure runs to some 14 or 15,000 pounds, though that number is almost certainly inflated by an admirer, and we should treat the sum with caution. The pattern, though, is not in doubt. Her charity was tied directly to her evangelical faith. To her, reform and mercy were the same project. This is the why of it. She did not see queenship as merely wearing jewels, but as a platform. And she read. She owned Tyndale's English New Testament and a French Bible. She kept reformist psalters and passed English scripture to the members of her household. She funded education. The court she built around herself was a cultured, serious, reform-leaning world within the world, lavish, where her rank demanded display, but with a genuine intellectual and religious core beating underneath the pageantry. For a moment, and it was only ever a moment, everything she had gambled for had come true. The refusal had paid off. The crown was real. The child was coming. The church was turning her way. She was, by her own chosen word, the most happy. Hold on to that, because it is the last time in her story that the word will fit. For she did not know, could not know, that the white falcon she had chosen as her own badge, the crowned bird rising out of the Tudor rose, would within 3 short years be hunted down in stone and paint and chiselled off every wall in England, as though she had never risen at all. The heralds had already written the announcements. All of them said the same word, Prince, Prince. The physicians had promised it, the astrologers had promised it, and a king who had broken 1,000 years of faith to father a legitimate son was not in the habit of being told no. So the documents were prepared in advance, and every one of them proclaimed the birth of a prince. On the 7th of September, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, Anne Boleyn was delivered of a healthy child, and the child was a girl. You can still feel the panic in the paperwork. The clerks did not have time to rewrite the announcements, so they did the only thing they could. They took a pen and added a single letter. Prince became princes. One hurried S scratched onto official documents across a kingdom to convert a triumph into a disappointment. The jousts planned to celebrate a male heir were quietly cancelled, and a court that had waited 7 years for this moment now spoke of it in the hushed, careful tones you use around a failure. Understand why this landed like a blow. Henry had not torn England out of the arms of Rome for a daughter. He already had a daughter, Mary, Catherine of Aragon's child. The entire, world-shaking gamble had been staked on one thing: a son who could not be questioned, could not be called a bastard, could carry the Tudor name into the next century. Anne's whole political value was that boy, and she had produced, instead, another girl. Except history has a cruel and beautiful sense of irony, because the disappointment in that cradle, the child everyone was trained to see as a dead end, was Elizabeth. Elizabeth I, the queen who would rule for 44 years, defeat an empire, and give her name to an entire age. Anne's enemies wanted a failure. What they got, cooling in the September air at Greenwich, was the greatest monarch England would ever have. Hold the family tree clear here, because it matters. Elizabeth was Anne's only surviving child, her one singular contribution to the line of kings. Mary, the elder half-sister, belonged to Catherine of Aragon. Mary was Anne's stepdaughter and Anne's enemy. 2 daughters, 2 mothers, 2 rival camps, and only one of those girls was Anne's. She would not get to raise her. Elizabeth would grow up in a world where her mother was a name you did not say, a scandal, an embarrassment, a woman legally unmade. And yet that girl would spend her life barely allowed to speak her mother's name and would carry Anne, in secret, all the way to her own grave. On the day they buried Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn lost the one thing that could have kept her alive. The 29th of January, 1536. At Peterborough, the woman Anne had displaced, the discarded first queen, still mourned across Catholic Europe as Henry's only true wife, was being lowered into the ground. And on that same day, in the palace at Greenwich, Anne miscarried. The child was a boy, about 15 weeks along, a son, the son the whole terrible machine had been built to produce, gone, on the very day her rival was carried to her tomb. The timing is almost too heavy to bear, and the people who lived through it felt it too. But we have to be precise about what actually happened in that room, because this is where the myth-makers went to work. You may have heard that the child Anne lost was deformed, a monstrous, misshapen thing, and that the sight of it convinced Henry his wife was a witch. Set that aside. It is not what the record says. That story comes from a single source. Nicholas Sander, a hostile Catholic writer, working 50 years after the fact, whose entire purpose was to paint Anne as a devil. The one modern historian who built a theory around it, Retha Warnicka, stands almost alone, and her only evidence is that same poisoned well. The people who were actually at court in 1536, including Chapuis, the ambassador who despised Anne and would have used anything against her, recorded only this: a male child, of about 15 weeks, nothing more, no horror, no deformity. Eric Ives, the great modern biographer, rejects the deformed fetus story outright. So should we. It is a smear wearing the costume of a fact. But the true version is devastating enough without the invention, because a lost son, in Anne's world, was not just a private grief. It was a political catastrophe. Understand the logic Henry lived by. Anne's entire claim to safety rested on giving him a male heir. That was the deal, spoken and unspoken. A living son made her untouchable, the mother of the future king. A daughter and a dead boy made her something far more dangerous, expendable. And Henry's eye had already begun to wander. Through that same spring, his affection cooled and turned toward one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, a quiet, pale, unthreatening young woman named Jane Seymour. Where Anne argued, Jane listened. Where Anne dazzled, Jane deferred. To a king wounded in his pride and desperate for a son, Jane looked like a second chance. So here is where the ground gives way. No living son meant no political value. No political value meant the machinery that had raised Anne to a throne could now be turned, coldly, to the work of removing her. And a man who had once sat beside her as her closest ally at the council table was already watching the wind change direction and deciding, quietly, which way it now blew. It did not take long to destroy a queen. It took Thomas Cromwell about 3 weeks. He was, of all people, the least likely assassin, because for years he had been Anne's ally. They were the two great reformers at Henry's court, pushing in the same direction, breaking the same church. But by the spring of 1536, the alliance had curdled into a rivalry that could only end with one of them destroyed. And so we have to ask the question this whole chapter turns on: why? Why did the man who had helped make Anne queen decide she had to die? The answer is layered, and every layer matters. First, faction. Court was a war of factions, and Anne's people and Cromwell's people were no longer on the same side. Second, and more concrete, was money. The vast wealth pouring out of the monasteries Cromwell was dissolving. Anne wanted that fortune spent on religious reform and charity, on schools, on scripture, on the poor. Cromwell wanted it in the king's treasury and under his own control. That was not a disagreement. That was a collision. Add foreign policy, where they pulled in opposite directions, and then add the one factor that made all the others lethal. Henry wanted Jane Seymour, and he wanted to be free. A king's wish is a kind of gravity. Everything bends toward it. So Cromwell built a case. Not investigated. Built. In roughly 3 weeks he assembled a charge sheet of staggering ambition. Adultery, incest, and conspiracy to murder the king. And to make it stand, he needed accused men. There were 5. Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest and most trusted intimates; Sir Francis Weston, a young courtier; William Brereton, a groom of the Privy Chamber; Mark Smeaton, a court musician; and the crucial weak link, a man of low enough birth to be threatened, pressured, and broken. Smeaton was the only one of the 5 who confessed, and he did so almost certainly under torture, or the naked threat of it. His confession was the plank the entire scaffold was built on, and the 5th man was George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's own brother, charged with committing incest with her. The cruelty of that was not incidental. It was the point, to make the horror total, to leave no corner of her life unpoisoned. But here is the detail that gives the whole thing away, the thread that unravels it. Eric Ives went back and checked the dates written into the indictments, the specific times and places Anne was supposed to have committed these crimes. And they are demonstrably impossible. On date after date, Anne was provably somewhere else entirely, in a different town, recovering from childbirth, attended by dozens of witnesses. The prosecution's own timeline is a physical impossibility. The overwhelming weight of modern scholarship, Ives, Weir, Lipscomb, Borman, reaches the same verdict: the charges were invented. There is one lone dissenter, G.W. Bernard, who argues she may have been guilty of something, but he stands almost alone, and even he concedes the evidence cannot prove it. The dates written into the charges could be checked, and every historian who has checked them has found the same thing. They are impossible. On the 15th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was brought into the Great Hall of the Tower of London to stand trial before a court of England's peers, and the man seated in the highest chair, the man appointed to preside over her judgment, was her own uncle. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Lord High Steward of England, sat as the head of the tribunal that would decide whether his sister's daughter lived or died. There is no gentler way to put it. The family that had climbed on Boleyn ambition and Howard blood now supplied the hand that would sign her off. She did not break. By every account that survives, Anne defended herself with a composure that unsettled the men who had come to condemn her, answering the charges point by point, calm, precise, giving nothing away to the hostile faces ranged against her. It was, witnesses admitted, an impressive performance. And it changed nothing. The verdict had been decided before she entered the room. She was found guilty of adultery, of incest, of conspiring the king's death, and sentenced, at the king's pleasure, to be burned or beheaded. Remember the uncle in the high chair, because history rhymes. 6 years later, the very same Duke of Norfolk would sit in judgment over another queen of his own blood, Catherine Howard, his other niece, and abandon her to the block, exactly as he abandoned Anne. Twice the Howards raised a girl to a throne. Twice, when the wind changed, they condemned her to keep themselves alive. Then came the logic that gives the whole affair away. On the 17th of May, the 5 accused men were led out and executed. Norris, Weston, Brereton, Smeaton, and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, all dead. And that same day, in a separate room, Archbishop Cranmer pronounced the marriage of Henry and Anne null and void. Sit with what that means. The Crown had just convicted Anne of committing adultery inside her marriage, and, in the same breath, declared that the marriage had never legally existed at all. She was found guilty of betraying a union the state simultaneously erased. You cannot be unfaithful to a marriage that was never real. Both things could not be true, and the men who wrote them knew it. The purpose was never coherence. The purpose was a dead queen and a clean slate. And the annulment did one thing more, quietly, that would echo for a generation. It declared the child of that marriage illegitimate. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was bastardized at a stroke, made the unwanted daughter of a marriage the Crown now said had never happened. This is why almost every serious historian who has examined the record reaches the same conclusion. The dates were impossible. The jury was packed. The verdict preceded the evidence. This was not a trial in any sense we would recognize. It was a demolition, dressed in the robes of the law, carried out in 3 weeks, and everyone standing in that hall understood precisely what they were watching. What remained now was only the manner of her killing. They brought a swordsman across the sea to kill her, and they called it mercy. In England, a condemned noblewoman met the axe, a heavy, clumsy instrument in unpracticed hands, a death that often took more than one blow. For Anne, Henry commuted the sentence to beheading and sent for an expert executioner from across the Channel, a man trained to take a head cleanly with a single stroke of a sword. Most accounts place him at Calais. Some say Saint-Omer, a small uncertainty in the record. What is not uncertain is the arithmetic of it. The killing was postponed a day, from the 18th to the 19th of May, because the Queen had to wait on the road for the man skilled enough to end her efficiently. That was the mercy on offer. A cleaner blade. At around 8 in the morning on the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold on Tower Green. And there she did something that has confused people for 5 centuries. She did not confess. She did not protest. She praised the king. The words that come down to us, reconstructed from the chroniclers, and varying slightly between them, so hold them loosely, have her say she came only to die, that by the law she was judged to die, and that she would speak nothing against it. Several accounts add that she called Henry one of the gentlest and most merciful princes there ever was. Read that as weakness, or as a guilty woman's surrender, and you have misread her completely. Understand why she said it. 2 forces held her tongue on that scaffold, and neither was agreement. The first was custom. A condemned person was expected to die submissively, to make no attack on the crown that killed them. It was the price of a dignified death. The second was love. Anne had a daughter, not yet 3, and a family whose survival now hung on her final performance. A defiant queen railing against her killers from the block could have brought the king's fury down on Elizabeth and on every Boleyn still breathing, so she gave them nothing to punish. Her restraint was not confession, it was a shield. Her last public act on this earth was to protect the child she was leaving behind. Then the sword fell, and it was over in an instant, the one thing they had given her. Her body was gathered up and buried, without ceremony, in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower walls, where it lies still. And history leaves a quiet footnote for the propagandists who came later. In 1876, during a Victorian restoration of that chapel, remains believed to be Anne's were examined before being reinterred. The bones told their own verdict. No 6th finger, no monstrous mark, no abnormality of any kind. A normal woman of around 35, refuted by her own skeleton 3 centuries after they buried her. But that particular lie had not even been invented yet. They had killed the Queen. Now they set out to unmake the fact that she had ever been one. The morning after they killed her, England began the second execution, the slower one, the erasure of the fact that Anne Boleyn had ever existed. Her badge, the crowned white falcon she had chosen for her own, was chiselled off the walls of the palaces and painted over. Her marriage had already been legally unmade. Her name became a thing you did not say aloud, a byword for scandal and shame. The regime that had built her a throne now set about scrubbing her from the surface of the country, as if a queen could be sanded away like a mistake in the stonework. But the cruelest erasure was not the removal of the real woman, it was the monster invented to stand in her place. In 1585, nearly 50 years after Anne was dead, a Catholic writer named Nicholas Sander published a history of the English schism, and in it he gave the world the Anne Boleyn most people still carry in their heads. The 6 fingers, the projecting tooth, the great wen beneath her chin, the mark of the witch on her skin. Understand what Sander was. He was a boy of about 6 when Anne was executed. He never saw her face. He was writing half a century after her death, with a single purpose: to prove that the woman who had pulled a king away from Rome was a literal devil, so that the Reformation she helped bring about could be framed as the work of a monster. Every physical deformity you have ever heard attached to Anne Boleyn traces back to that one hostile book, written by a man who was in the nursery when she died. And here is the proof it was invention. Not one person who actually knew Anne, not one contemporary, friendly or hostile, ever recorded a deformity of any kind. Even the sources with no reason to flatter her are silent on it. A Venetian diplomat who saw her in the flesh and clearly was not charmed described her plainly as not among the handsomest women in the world, dark-complexioned, with a long neck and a wide mouth. And yet even he, cataloguing her flaws, paused on one thing and recorded it as beauty. Her eyes, he wrote, black and beautiful. A man determined to find her plain still could not invent a sixth finger, because there was none to see. The final theft is the quietest. No undisputed portrait of Anne Boleyn, painted from life, survives. The famous image with the bee at her throat is a later copy of a lost original. The men who destroyed her came very close to taking even her face, so that we argue to this day over what she truly looked like. And then the wheel turned. On the 17th of November, 1558, Anne's daughter became Queen Elizabeth I of England. Suddenly, it was politic to remember Anne, not as the witch, but as the reformer she had been. And Elizabeth finished the work. The reform her mother had championed with smuggled Bibles and promoted bishops, Elizabeth made permanent, settling the Protestant Church of England for good. Everything Anne was killed for, her daughter completed. Which brings us, at last, to the ring. For nearly 30 years, Elizabeth wore a locket ring that almost no one was permitted to open. Only when she died, in 1603, was the tiny bezel finally prized apart, and inside were two small portraits, facing one another. One was Elizabeth herself, the other, a woman in the French hood of the 1530s, is believed to be Anne Boleyn. We cannot prove it. Some have suggested it could be Catherine Parr, and honesty requires the caveat, but the emotional truth survives it. For 44 years on the throne, the daughter of the erased queen kept her mother hidden in gold against her own hand, and told no one, carrying the woman England was ordered to forget, in secret, all the way to her own grave. They tried to erase her. They scratched her falcon off the walls, annulled her marriage into nothing, and let a stranger invent her a monster's body 50 years after she was dead. History was told to remember a witch who bewitched a king, and to forget the woman who helped remake a church, and who handed England its greatest queen. But you cannot erase a woman whose daughter wears her, in secret, against her own hand for 30 years. The witch was invented. The seductress was a slander. What actually stood on that scaffold was a brilliant, cornered, French-educated reformer, dying to protect the child who would prove them all wrong. So, who was she, really, and why did they need her erased? That is your answer. Not the monster, Anne Boleyn, the queen they tried to erase, and could not.